The perfect illusion. It was a radiant summer day, the kind that made everything feel lighter. The trees swayed in the soft breeze, their leaves casting playful shadows on the streets below. At Oak Ridge Estates, life seemed nothing short of perfect. The pristine lawns, meticulously maintained, were trimmed to perfection, and the houses that lined the streets stood proud, boasting neat facades that hinted at the lives of comfort and privilege that their inhabitants enjoyed. It was the kind of neighborhood people dreamed of, a suburban utopia, where the days were slow, the nights peaceful, and everyone knew everyone. At the center of this peaceful existence stood the Oak Ridge Community Pool, a glittering beacon of suburban life. The pool was more than just a place to cool off. It was the heart of the community. It was where neighbors gathered on lazy afternoons, sharing idle gossip while their children splashed happily in the water. A place where weekend barbecues and casual conversations created a sense of camaraderie among residents. In Oak Ridge Estates, the pool was a symbol of belonging, of having made it, and those who frequented it carried an air of exclusivity that was unmistakable. Among the poolside regulars was Karen Whitfield. Known as the Queen Bee of the Oak Ridge social scene, Karen was always impeccably dressed, her blonde hair styled just so, her clothes the latest in suburban chic. She had a way of making her presence known without saying a word, her posture straight, her eyes sharp. Though she often carried an air of friendliness, those who knew her well could sense the subtle undertones of judgment that lay just beneath the surface of her smiles. Karen ruled Oak Ridge Estates, not officially, but through a series of unspoken rules that everyone seemed to understand. On this particular Saturday afternoon, Karen lounged on her usual chair near the pool's edge, sunglasses perched on her head as she flipped through a fashion magazine. Around her, the scene was perfect. Children played in the water, their laughter ringing out under the bright sun, while their parents sat on the lounge chairs, chatting and sipping cold drinks. A few yards away, a group of women, Karen's inner circle, whispered excitedly about an upcoming neighborhood event, their voices hushed but animated. Everything was in its place, just as it should be, until Jasmine and her son Landon arrived. Jasmine Johnson had moved to Oak Ridge Estates just 6 months ago, but in those 6 months, she had made an impression. Tall, with a striking presence, Jasmine carried herself with a quiet confidence that commanded respect. Her dark skin seemed to glow in the sunlight, and her natural hair, styled in neat braids, framed her face beautifully. As she walked, her stride was purposeful, her head held high, her every step exuding grace and strength. Jasmine wasn't just another resident of Oak Ridge. She was a successful civil rights attorney, a woman who had fought her way to the top and made sure to bring others with her. Moving to Oak Ridge had been a decision she had made for her son, Landon. She wanted him to grow up in a safe, comfortable environment, a place where he could thrive. At 8 years old, Landon was the very picture of joy. His eyes sparkled with mischief, his wide grin revealing the gap where his front tooth used to be. Today, like most days, he was full of energy, practically bouncing with excitement as they approached the pool. His swim trunks, adorned with cartoon sharks, flapped around his legs as he ran ahead of his mother, goggles clutched tightly in his hand. "Mom, can we go faster? Please," Landon pleaded, turning back to his mother with an eager grin. Jasmine smiled, quickening her pace slightly. "Slow down, champ. The pool's not going anywhere." As they approached the entrance to the pool, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Moving to Oak Ridge Estates had been a milestone in her life. It represented not only her success, but also her belief in the power of integration. She had chosen this neighborhood because she wanted Landon to grow up in a diverse environment, where he could learn to navigate the world with confidence. The community pool was just another symbol of that, a place where all children, regardless of their background, could come together and enjoy their childhood. But as Jasmine stepped through the gate, her eyes scanned the crowd, and she immediately felt the familiar, unspoken tension. The eyes of the other mothers, mostly white, flickered toward her, their polite smiles hiding something deeper. It was a look she had encountered more times than she could count, one that made her feel as though she were being measured, evaluated. She held her head high, refusing to let the weight of their scrutiny affect her. "Remember what we talked about, Landon," she said, her voice calm and steady. "What do we do if anyone's unkind?" Landon gave an exaggerated roll of his eyes. "I know, Mom. We stay calm and use our words. Can we go swim now?" Jasmine chuckled, ruffling his hair affectionately. "That's my boy. Go on then. I'll be right behind you." As Landon darted toward the pool, Jasmine spotted Karen Whitfield out of the corner of her eye. She was seated in her usual spot, her gaze scanning the pool with the practiced air of someone accustomed to having control. Jasmine had crossed paths with Karen a few times since moving to the neighborhood, but their interactions had been limited. Karen was always polite, in that overly sweet way that carried an underlying sharpness. Jasmine had never had a direct confrontation with her, but there was always an unspoken tension, a sense that Karen was watching, waiting for something. And today, it seemed, she had found it. Landon, full of excitement, made his way to the pool's edge, his feet barely touching the ground as he prepared to leap into the cool water. But before he could jump, a hand shot out, grabbing him by the arm and jerking him to a stop. "Now just a minute, young man." Karen's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "I don't believe I've seen you here before. Are you a resident?" Landon, startled, looked up at her, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. I live here with my mom," he stammered, his small voice trembling as he pointed toward Jasmine. Karen's grip on his arm tightened slightly, her expression stern. "I'm sorry, but I can't just take your word for it. This pool is for residents only, and I don't recognize you." Jasmine, who had been watching from a distance, felt a surge of anger rise within her. She moved quickly toward her son, her protective instincts kicking in. "Karen, what are you doing? Let go of my son." Karen turned to face Jasmine, her expression one of feigned concern. "Jasmine, I'm sure you understand. We have to be careful about who we let use the facilities. There have been incidents in the past with outsiders causing trouble." The words hung in the air, thick with insinuation. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted. The idle chatter had quieted, and other residents were now watching the scene unfold. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to do, while others whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued. Landon, his earlier excitement now replaced by fear, stood frozen by his mother's side. Jasmine gently pried Karen's hand from her son's arm, her voice steady but firm. "Karen, we are residents. We've lived here for 6 months. Landon has every right to swim in this pool." Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips pursed into a thin line. "Well, I've never seen him here before," she said, her tone icy. "And frankly, I find it hard to believe that you've been here for 6 months without using the pool." Jasmine took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the entire pool area on her, waiting to see what she would do next. The tension in the air was palpable, the lines of division drawn clearly for everyone to see. But Jasmine knew this was more than just a confrontation. This was about standing up, not just for herself and her son, but for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. She wasn't about to back down. As the sun beat down on the Oak Ridge estates, the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave the entire community speechless. Breaking the surface. The tension was palpable as Jasmine stood her ground, facing Karen Whitfield, whose icy demeanor had spread like frost over the Oak Ridge community pool. Jasmine could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, a familiar feeling she had experienced too many times. She was no stranger to these moments, the subtle yet potent reminders that people like her weren't always considered a natural part of spaces like this. Jasmine's heart raced, but her face remained composed, as if sculpted from stone. She knew what was happening. This wasn't just about access to the pool. It was about belonging, about who had the right to be in certain spaces and who didn't. And more than anything, it was about teaching her son Landon how to respond to the world's ugliness without becoming a part of it. Landon stood by her side, holding her hand, his earlier joy now replaced by confusion and a hint of fear. His young mind was trying to process what had just happened. All he had wanted was to jump into the pool and have some fun like the other kids. But instead, he found himself at the center of something much bigger, something he couldn't yet fully understand. Jasmine knelt down beside Landon, placing her hand on his shoulder. She looked into his wide, innocent eyes, and her voice softened, as if to remind him of the strength she knew he had. "It's okay, buddy," she said gently. "You did nothing wrong." Landon nodded, but his gaze darted nervously toward Karen, who stood just a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, as if she were waiting for an apology that would never come. Karen's eyes were cold and calculating as they flicked between Jasmine and Landon. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Jasmine. In her mind, she was doing what she thought was right, protecting the pool from outsiders, though she knew perfectly well that Jasmine and her son lived in the neighborhood. The unspoken truth hung between them like a shadow. This wasn't about residency. It was about race. "Well," Karen said after a long pause, her voice clipped and condescending, "if you really live here, then you should know that we have certain standards. It's not just about swimming. It's about maintaining the community atmosphere." Jasmine's eyebrows raised slightly, but she kept her voice calm. "Standards, Karen. What exactly do you mean by that?" Karen let out a huff, her eyes scanning the people around her as if searching for validation. A few of the other mothers looked away, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation was heading, but none of them spoke up. They were content to let Karen play her part as the self-appointed enforcer of Oak Ridge's unwritten rules. "You know exactly what I mean," Karen said, her tone almost mocking. "We have a certain way of doing things here, Jasmine. I've never seen you or your son at any of the community events, and I've certainly never seen you at the pool before today. People who live here participate in the neighborhood. They're active members of the community. We like to keep things orderly." Jasmine could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had encountered people like Karen before, people who believed they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't, who used coded language and veiled threats to maintain control. But Jasmine wasn't here for a fight. She was here to teach Landon how to navigate these situations with grace and strength. "Orderly," Jasmine repeated, her voice cool but steady. "Karen, my son and I have every right to be here. We're residents, just like you. And whether we attend every community event or use the pool every day doesn't change that. This pool is for everyone who lives here, and that includes us." Karen's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "If you say so, but I think you'll find that not everyone here feels the same way." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jasmine's eyes flicked toward the small group of mothers who had been whispering to each other moments ago. Their faces were now tight with discomfort, but none of them made a move to defend Jasmine. They had seen what was happening, but they weren't willing to get involved. Jasmine took a deep breath, then turned to Landon. "Go ahead, sweetheart," she said softly, encouraging him. "Go swim. I'll be right here watching you." Landon hesitated, his eyes wide as he looked from his mother to Karen, and back again. "Are you sure, Mom?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine smiled, her hand gently brushing his cheek. "I'm sure. You have every right to be here. Now go have fun." With that, Landon nodded, his small body relaxing just a little. He turned and made his way to the pool's edge, where other kids were playing. For a brief moment, he stood there, unsure, but then he took a deep breath and jumped in, the water splashing around him as he submerged beneath the surface. As Jasmine watched her son swim, a sense of pride welled up inside her. Landon was young, but he was already learning the hard lessons of life: how to stand up for himself, how to remain calm in the face of injustice, and how to hold his head high even when others tried to make him feel small. These were lessons Jasmine had hoped to delay for a few more years, but the world, it seemed, had other plans. Karen, however, was not done. She watched Landon swim for a few moments, her face unreadable, before turning her gaze back to Jasmine. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Karen said, her voice low and pointed. "This could have been a simple misunderstanding, but now you've made it into something else." Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly. "I haven't made this into anything, Karen. You stopped my son from swimming in a pool that he has every right to be in. You questioned his right to be here. That's what this is about." Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Coming into this neighborhood, acting like you belong here." "I do belong here," Jasmine replied firmly. "And so does my son." Karen's expression hardened, and for a moment, it seemed like she might say something even more cutting. But then, as if realizing that she had pushed the situation as far as it could go, she stepped back, raising her hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "Do what you want, but don't say I didn't warn you. People talk, Jasmine, and they don't like it when someone tries to disrupt the balance." With that, Karen turned and walked back to her lounge chair, picking up her magazine, as if nothing had happened. But Jasmine knew that this wasn't over. Karen's warning had been clear, and while Jasmine wasn't afraid of what might come next, she was prepared. As she watched Landon laugh and play in the water, his earlier fear washed away with each splash, Jasmine's resolve only strengthened. She hadn't come to Oak Ridge Estates to hide or shrink away from who she was. She had moved here to show her son that he belonged in any space, no matter who tried to tell him otherwise. In the coming days, Karen's warning would prove to be more than just empty words. The whispers in the neighborhood would grow louder, and the division between those who supported Jasmine and those who sided with Karen would become more pronounced. But Jasmine knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going anywhere. This was her home, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The ripple effect. The following week was a strange one for Jasmine. Though life at Oak Ridge Estates went on as usual on the surface, she couldn't ignore the shift in the atmosphere. Her interactions with some of her neighbors were suddenly strained, with smiles that were just a little too tight or greetings that felt forced and insincere. The once warm exchanges between her and certain members of the community were now filled with an unspoken tension that lurked beneath their polite words. Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew exactly what was happening. Karen Whitfield's subtle brand of exclusion was spreading through the neighborhood like a slow, creeping vine. Conversations had been had, rumors had likely circulated, and people were picking sides, even if they pretended not to. It started small. On Wednesday, Jasmine noticed that the invitation to the monthly neighborhood coffee meetup, which she previously received without fail, had conspicuously failed to arrive. It wasn't an official event, just a casual gathering of the Oak Ridge mothers, but it had been one of the few places where Jasmine had started to feel connected to the other women. Now, that connection seemed to be fraying. Maybe they just forgot this time, she told herself as she scrolled through her email, hoping to find a stray invitation in her spam folder. But deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't been forgotten. She'd been excluded. Jasmine's son, Landon, seemed blissfully unaware of the undercurrents swirling around them, which was a small relief. To him, the pool incident was already a distant memory. He was back to his usual cheerful self, spending his afternoons chasing butterflies in the backyard, reading his favorite comic books, and playing with the few friends he had made at school. But even there, Jasmine noticed changes, subtle but unmistakable. One afternoon, while picking him up from school, Jasmine saw Landon standing by himself near the swings, staring at a group of boys who were playing a game of tag. Normally, Landon would have been right in the middle of the action, his laughter ringing out as he ran with the other kids. But today, he stood off to the side, clutching his backpack, his expression one of quiet resignation. Jasmine's heart sank. She walked over, trying to keep her voice light. "Hey, buddy, how was school today?" Landon looked up, managing a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It was okay." Jasmine frowned, kneeling down beside him. "Why aren't you playing with the other kids?" Landon shrugged, looking away. "I don't know. They said they already had enough people for the game." The words hit Jasmine like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time she'd heard something like this. Growing up, she had often been the extra in games, the one who wasn't needed but wasn't told so directly. It stung every time, but she had learned to deal with it. Now, though, seeing her son experience the same subtle exclusion was almost too much to bear. "Did something happen?" Jasmine asked gently, trying to keep the anger from creeping into her voice. Landon hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "No, they just didn't want me to play today, I guess." Jasmine wanted to press him for more details, but she knew better than to push too hard. Landon wasn't the type to complain or make a fuss, and she didn't want to burden him with her suspicions. But her heart ached for him. The children might not fully understand the prejudice they were acting out, but she had no doubt that Karen's influence was trickling down, infecting even the youngest members of the community. That evening, after putting Landon to bed, Jasmine sat on the couch with her husband, Marcus. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor that had always been her anchor. They had been married for over a decade, and in that time, Marcus had always been the one to keep her grounded when things got tough. "You've been quiet," Marcus observed, setting down his newspaper and turning to her. "Something on your mind?" Jasmine sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's just this whole Karen situation. I thought it would blow over, but now it feels like things are getting worse." Marcus frowned. "What happened?" Jasmine recounted the week's events, the missing invitation, the strange looks from some of the neighbors, and Landon's experience at school. As she spoke, Marcus's expression darkened, his jaw tightening in that familiar way that told her he was angry but trying to stay calm for her sake. "Landon didn't say much about it, but I can tell something's bothering him," Jasmine said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think the other kids are starting to distance themselves because of what happened at the pool." Marcus leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This is exactly why I didn't want to move here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Jasmine nodded, knowing where this conversation was headed. When they had first decided to move to Oak Ridge Estates, Marcus had been hesitant. He had grown up in a predominantly black neighborhood and was wary of moving into an area that was so overwhelmingly white and affluent. But Jasmine had pushed for it, believing that it was important for their son to grow up in a diverse environment, even if that diversity came with challenges. "I know," she said quietly, "but I thought it would be different. I thought that people here would be more accepting." "They're polite," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference between being polite and being accepting." Jasmine sighed again, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I just don't know what to do. Part of me wants to fight this head on, to confront Karen and make it clear that we're not going anywhere. But then there's Landon. I don't want to make things harder for him." Marcus was silent for a moment, his hand resting gently on her back. "You've always been the fighter, Jazz. But maybe this time, it's not about fighting. Maybe it's about showing them that we're better than this." Jasmine looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Marcus smiled softly. "I mean, we don't need to stoop to Karen's level. We don't need to get into a war of words or try to prove ourselves to people who don't matter. What we need to do is show them, through our actions, that we belong here, that we're just as much a part of this community as anyone else." Jasmine considered his words, her mind turning over the possibilities. Marcus was right. Confronting Karen head-on might only escalate the situation, making things more difficult for Landon. But what if they could show the community who they really were? What if they could change the narrative by simply being themselves, by being visible and present in every part of Oak Ridge life? The next day, Jasmine made a decision. She wasn't going to let Karen or anyone else dictate how she lived her life or how her family was treated. She was going to reclaim her place in the neighborhood, not by fighting fire with fire, but by being undeniable, by showing up, participating, and refusing to be invisible. Her first step was simple but significant. That weekend, Oak Ridge Estates was hosting its annual summer block party, a big event that drew nearly all the residents to the Central Park for an afternoon of food, games, and community bonding. It was the perfect opportunity to make a statement without saying a word. On Saturday morning, Jasmine woke early, determined to make a contribution that no one could ignore. She spent hours in the kitchen, preparing her famous peach cobbler, a recipe passed down from her grandmother that had won praise at countless family gatherings and potlucks. She made 2 large pans of it, carefully wrapping them in foil before heading out with Marcus and Landon to the park. When they arrived, the park was already buzzing with activity. Long tables were set up under large tents, and families were milling about, chatting and laughing as they set up their contributions for the potluck. Jasmine spotted Karen almost immediately, standing at one of the tables with a group of women, her laugh loud and exaggerated as she spoke. Ignoring the knot in her stomach, Jasmine walked over to one of the tables and set down her peach cobbler, making sure it was in a prime spot. She could feel the eyes of the other women on her, but she refused to acknowledge them. Instead, she smiled and turned to Marcus. "Let's go find a seat," she said brightly, determined to enjoy the day. As the afternoon wore on, Jasmine and Marcus made their rounds, chatting with the few neighbors who hadn't been swayed by Karen's influence. Landon played with a group of kids, his laughter filling the air as he chased them across the park. And then something surprising happened. One by one, people began to gather around the dessert table, curious about the peach cobbler. Jasmine watched from a distance as a few women took a bite, their eyes widening in delight. Word spread quickly, and soon, nearly everyone was talking about how delicious it was. Jasmine couldn't help but smile as she watched the scene unfold. She hadn't come to the block party to win anyone over, but it seemed that her actions had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. A rising tide. By the time the block party had hit its peak, Jasmine's peach cobbler had become the unofficial star of the event. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to her in weeks were suddenly coming up to her, asking for the recipe, praising her baking, and complimenting her for the incredible dish. It was a small victory, but for Jasmine, it was a powerful one. The shift wasn't just about dessert, though. It was about visibility. Jasmine had made herself undeniable, not by demanding acceptance, but by contributing in a way that no one could ignore. It was a subtle, yet profound, act of resistance, a way of asserting her family's place in the community without uttering a word of confrontation. Karen Whitfield, on the other hand, watched from the sidelines. Her group of friends still clung to her, but Jasmine noticed how their attention was divided now. They whispered and exchanged glances as people complimented Jasmine's cobbler and engaged with her family. Karen, who had been the queen bee of Oak Ridge social life, now seemed uncomfortable, her tightly controlled social dominance beginning to crack. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting a warm glow over the park, the neighborhood kids started gathering for the evening's big event, the annual tug-of-war competition. It was a much-anticipated tradition, where families and friends split into teams, pulling a long rope across the grassy field until one side claimed victory. Landon, excited as always, ran over to Jasmine and Marcus, his face flushed with excitement. "Mom, Dad, can we do it this year, please?" he begged, bouncing on his toes. He had asked the same question the previous year, but Jasmine had hesitated then, still feeling new to the neighborhood. This year, however, she looked at Marcus, and they both nodded. "Of course, buddy," Marcus said, smiling. "Let's show them what we're made of." The three of them joined one of the teams, standing side by side with other neighbors. Jasmine noticed a few familiar faces, people who had once been cool toward her, but were now warming up, perhaps softened by the shared camaraderie of the day. Landon was sandwiched between his parents, his small hands gripping the thick rope tightly. As the game began, a playful rivalry broke out between the two sides. Shouts and laughter echoed across the field as both teams strained against each other, muscles taut, faces red with effort. Landon, small but determined, pulled with all his might, his face crunched up in concentration. On the opposing team, Jasmine saw Karen Whitfield and her husband, their group of friends rallying around them. Karen's eyes met Jasmine's for a brief moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them before Karen looked away, her focus shifting back to the game. For a while, the contest seemed evenly matched, with neither side gaining much ground. But then, slowly, Jasmine's team began to inch forward, their collective strength overpowering the other side. Landon squealed with delight as their team surged ahead, pulling the rope steadily until Karen's side faltered. With a final heave, Jasmine's team won, sending their opponents stumbling and collapsing in a heap of laughter. Landon jumped up and down, his joy infectious as he high-fived his teammates. Jasmine and Marcus exchanged a proud look, and for the first time in weeks, Jasmine felt a sense of peace. They had done it. Not just the tug-of-war, but something much bigger. They had begun to carve out their space in Oak Ridge, despite the undercurrents of exclusion that Karen had tried to stir. After the game, as people drifted back to their picnic tables and blankets, Jasmine found herself in conversation with a few of the other mothers, women who had once seemed distant or indifferent toward her. They asked her about her work as a civil rights lawyer, complimented her parenting, and made small talk about the upcoming school year. It wasn't lost on Jasmine that these same women had likely been swayed by Karen's subtle attempts to isolate her. Yet here they were now, laughing and chatting as if the past few weeks of cold shoulders and whispered gossip had never happened. It was a reminder of how fickle these social circles could be, how quickly people shifted allegiances when they saw the tides turning. As the night wore on, and the block party began to wind down, Jasmine and Marcus gathered their things, preparing to head home. Landon, exhausted from the day's activities, had already curled up on a blanket, his head resting on Jasmine's lap as she gently stroked his hair. Just as they were about to leave, Karen Whitfield approached them. Jasmine's body tensed involuntarily at the sight of her, wondering if Karen had something snide or passive-aggressive to say. But to her surprise, Karen's expression was different. She looked hesitant, almost uncertain, as if she were weighing her words carefully. "Jasmine," Karen began, her voice softer than usual. I just wanted to apologize for what happened at the pool last week. I think I might have overreacted. It wasn't personal." Jasmine blinked, taken aback by the unexpected apology. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Karen's words seemed rehearsed, as if she had practiced them before walking over, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was at least attempting sincerity. "Thank you for saying that," Jasmine replied carefully, not wanting to betray the complex emotions swirling inside her. She didn't trust Karen, and she certainly didn't believe that this apology meant Karen had suddenly seen the error of her ways, but it was a step, a small, cautious step toward acknowledging the wrong. Karen shifted uncomfortably. "The truth is, I've been in this neighborhood for a long time, and I'm used to things being a certain way. But I've come to realize that maybe it's time for some things to change." Jasmine nodded, still unsure where this conversation was heading. "I know we haven't seen eye to eye," Karen continued, glancing at Landon, who was now dozing peacefully in Jasmine's lap. "But I hope we can move forward from here, for the sake of the community." There it was, the not-so-subtle plea for peace, wrapped in the guise of concern for the community. Jasmine knew this type of apology well. It wasn't really about making amends. It was about restoring Karen's sense of control, about smoothing over the disruption without truly addressing the underlying issues. Still, Jasmine decided to take the higher road. She had no desire to escalate the situation or create further tension. "I appreciate that, Karen," she said, her voice measured. "I hope so too." Karen gave a tight-lipped smile, clearly relieved that the exchange hadn't turned into a confrontation. She muttered something about seeing them around and walked away, rejoining her circle of friends. As she disappeared into the crowd, Jasmine exhaled, feeling a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, and a lingering sense of weariness. As they walked home, Marcus glanced at Jasmine, his brow furrowed. "Do you think she meant it?" he asked. Jasmine shrugged, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know. Maybe. But even if she didn't, that's not really the point. What matters is that we keep showing up. We don't let people like Karen define our place here." Marcus smiled, nodding in agreement. "You're right. We've come too far to let anyone push us out." Jasmine squeezed his hand, grateful for his steady presence. Together, they had weathered storms before, and this was just one more challenge in a long line of battles. But she knew now that they weren't alone. There were people in the community who had seen past the surface-level divisions, people who were beginning to accept them for who they were. And most importantly, there was Landon. His innocence and joy were reminders of why they had fought so hard to create a life here, why they had chosen Oak Ridge Estates in the first place. It wasn't just about the beautiful houses or the pristine neighborhood. It was about giving him a place to grow up, to thrive, and to learn that no matter where he was, he belonged. The next day, as they walked to the pool together, Jasmine felt lighter than she had in weeks. Landon ran ahead, eager to dive into the cool water, while Marcus carried their towels and swim gear. As they passed by other neighbors on their way to the pool, Jasmine noticed the difference: a few more nods of acknowledgement, a few more smiles that felt genuine. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was progress. And sometimes, that was enough. The unseen battle. The summer days grew longer in Oakwood Estates, and the community began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. Jasmine felt it in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed. She had always believed that real change started with individuals, with everyday actions, and not grand gestures. But this shift, it was the result of both: an individual's willingness to stand their ground and the community's readiness to confront its biases, albeit slowly. Jasmine's interactions with the neighbors became more frequent, though often still cautious. There was a sense of wariness in the air, but also a thread of curiosity. In the weeks following the block party, several residents approached her, apologizing for their previous indifference or for not having spoken up sooner. Some admitted they had been uncomfortable with how the situation at the pool had unfolded, but didn't know how to intervene. They had been complicit in their silence, and Jasmine knew this was an important turning point. These weren't radical or dramatic gestures, but they were the first signs of change, small cracks in the armor of Oakwood's social structure. Karen Whitfield, however, remained a constant, though her presence now carried a tension that had not been there before. Jasmine could see the way Karen's interactions with the neighbors had shifted as well. She no longer sat at the center of the group during gatherings, and when she did speak, her voice was softer, her posture more restrained. It was a subtle shift, but to Jasmine, it spoke volumes. One afternoon, after another day of work, Jasmine found herself heading to the community pool with Landon in tow. Marcus was away for the weekend, visiting family out of state, so it was just her and her son. Landon had been begging for a chance to swim all week, and today, Jasmine had promised that they would go. They entered the pool area, Landon bouncing ahead, his excitement palpable. As they neared the gate, Jasmine noticed Karen lounging under an umbrella, a book in hand, but her attention was on something else. Jasmine steeled herself, her thoughts returning to the events of weeks ago, when Karen had grabbed Landon's arm, halting him at the poolside. The memory was still fresh, as were the emotions that had followed: the outrage, the fear, the sense of helplessness. But she had moved past it, knowing that allowing herself to be consumed by it would only give Karen more power. Landon, oblivious to the tension that always seemed to follow his mother's interactions with Karen, ran toward the pool with the usual boundless energy that defined his youth. Jasmine followed at a slower pace, adjusting her sunglasses as she watched him disappear into the water, his joy unmistakable. Just as Jasmine sat down on one of the lounge chairs by the pool's edge, Karen's voice broke the stillness of the air. It was polite, if not a bit too forced. "Jasmine, isn't it?" Karen's tone was overly cheerful, a bit too sharp to be genuine. Jasmine didn't look up immediately but felt Karen's presence hover near her. Finally, she responded, her voice steady and calm. "Yes, Karen. How are you today?" There was a beat of silence, and then Karen responded, this time softer, as if testing the waters. "I wanted to say, I've been thinking about our conversation a few weeks ago, and I wanted to apologize again. I didn't mean to come across the way I did." Jasmine remained still, her eyes fixed on Landon, who was now swinging laps, his little arms slicing through the water. He was happy, and that was all that mattered in this moment. Still, Karen's words hovered in the air, and Jasmine knew it was important to acknowledge them. "Thank you, Karen. I appreciate your apology. I think we both know that things went too far, but I'm glad we're moving forward," Jasmine replied, her voice neutral, measured. She wasn't about to pretend that everything was fine, but she wasn't going to allow herself to be dragged into a confrontation either. Karen nodded, shifting her weight on the lounge chair, visibly uncomfortable but trying her best to maintain composure. "I think you're right. I've also been thinking about how things have changed in Oakwood, and, well, I want you to know I've been speaking to some of the other residents. I'm trying to be more understanding, I suppose." Jasmine turned her head slightly, her gaze now locked with Karen's. "That's a good start," she said simply. Karen seemed to appreciate the brief recognition, but it was clear that the conversation wasn't over. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "Jasmine, I've lived here for a long time, and there are traditions, things that I've come to think of as part of this community. It's not that I ever intended to be hurtful, but sometimes change. It's hard for people to accept." Jasmine raised her eyebrows slightly, considering her response carefully. "I understand that, Karen, but change is inevitable. It's the only way a community can truly grow and evolve. And it's not about erasing traditions or the things that made this neighborhood what it is. It's about making space for more people, for more experiences." Karen looked away for a moment, seemingly grappling with the truth of Jasmine's words. "I've thought a lot about that," she said quietly, then let out a breath. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, and I realize that I've been blind to it." Jasmine felt a surge of both frustration and sympathy. She had long since grown tired of educating people who were too set in their ways to understand, but she also knew that Karen's recognition, however small, was a crucial step. If Karen was beginning to question her own biases, then it was possible others in the community were as well. Change often started with uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes it wasn't about an apology. It was about learning to listen. "Karen," Jasmine said, her voice softening just a bit, "I don't expect you to understand everything overnight. But I do expect that we respect each other, that we give each other space to exist without fear of being judged or pushed aside. My son deserves to feel like he belongs here, just like anyone else." Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. There was no immediate response, no promise of complete understanding, but the silence between them wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful. Just then, Landon called out to Jasmine from the pool. "Mom, come in. The water's awesome." His voice broke through the tension like a breath of fresh air. Jasmine smiled, grateful for the interruption. She stood up, adjusting her sunglasses as she looked at Karen. "I have to go," she said, her tone warm but firm. "But thank you for the conversation, Karen. We'll talk again soon." Karen didn't reply immediately, but there was a change in her expression, a flicker of something resembling respect, or at least a recognition of the need to move beyond old prejudices. She simply nodded as Jasmine headed toward the pool, where Landon was waiting. As Jasmine slipped into the water, Landon splashed around her, his laughter filling the air. She held him close for a moment, the warm water enveloping them both as they floated together, the sun now low in the sky, casting golden reflections on the surface. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt like a small victory in the battle she had been fighting, not just for her family, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. In the distance, she saw Karen still sitting under her umbrella, but this time her posture was different. Her arms were relaxed, her shoulders no longer tight. She was watching, observing, but not with the same critical eye as before. Jasmine didn't know what would happen next, or if Karen's shift in behavior was genuine. But for the first time, she felt hopeful that things were beginning to change, even if it was just one small step at a time. A new dawn. The weeks following that conversation at the pool were transformative. As summer wore on, the tension in Oakwood Estates seemed to ebb away, like the tide retreating to reveal the ocean floor beneath. Jasmine could feel it in her interactions with the neighbors, the unspoken change that hung in the air, as if something had shifted permanently. Oakwood was still Oakwood, its perfectly manicured lawns, the smell of freshly cut grass, and the faint scent of barbecue smoke filling the weekends, but something had changed beneath the surface. Jasmine knew that the community was not the same as it had been before the incident at the pool. Jasmine's daily life became a little more peaceful. There was a sense of lightness that had not existed before. Even though some people still avoided her at social gatherings, or perhaps simply didn't know how to approach her after what had happened, there were others who actively sought out her company. And those who had been silent before, neighbors who had stayed on the sidelines during the entire ordeal, were now starting to step forward. She'd overheard snippets of conversation during trips to the grocery store, or while picking Landon up from school, small gestures that suggested the community was slowly becoming more inclusive, more self-aware. Karen Whitefield, too, had become a subject of gossip, but not the kind Jasmine had expected. Karen, once the untouchable queen bee of Oakwood, was no longer the one in control of the social dynamics. Instead, her attempt to assert her authority had backfired. It wasn't as if she had become universally liked, but she had become a figure of curiosity, someone the neighbors watched, waiting to see if she would change, if she could make amends, even in small ways. One Saturday afternoon, as the sun hung low over Oakwood Estates, Jasmine stood at her front door, looking out over the street. Landon was riding his bike up and down the driveway, his laughter echoing across the neighborhood. She watched him for a moment, that familiar protective feeling washing over her. Then, a knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Linda Peterson, a neighbor from 2 doors down, standing there with a hesitant smile. Linda was one of those people who had always been quiet but kind. She had never been overtly racist, nor had she been particularly outspoken during the pool incident. She had simply stayed out of it. Jasmine had always suspected that Linda had her own silent struggles with the changing dynamics of the community, though she had never expressed them. "Hey, Jasmine, can I talk to you for a minute?" Linda asked, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Of course," Jasmine said, stepping aside to let Linda in. "Is everything okay?" Linda entered the house, and they made their way to the living room. Landon zoomed past the window on his bike, and Jasmine caught the sight of his grin. Linda noticed too, and there was a soft smile on her face as she watched him. "He's a good kid," she said quietly. "I see him riding his bike up and down here all the time." Jasmine smiled. "He's got a lot of energy. He's been asking me if we can go swimming today, but I think he's trying to wear himself out first." Linda chuckled. "I remember those days with my own kids. I guess that's the one thing about being a parent that doesn't change, huh?" There was a long pause. Then Linda turned toward Jasmine with a deep breath. "I wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the pool. I didn't say anything then, and I feel bad about that. I should have spoken up. It wasn't right, what Karen did, and I guess I just didn't want to make waves." Jasmine looked at Linda, surprised by her admission. She had expected the community to stay quiet, to pretend like nothing had happened. But here was Linda, admitting her own complicity, her own role in allowing the situation to unfold without intervening. "I don't know if me saying anything now helps or if it's even the right time," Linda continued, looking down at her hands. "But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I've been talking with my husband, and we've decided that we can't sit back and watch these kinds of things happen anymore. We have to do better." Jasmine blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in Linda's words. It wasn't an apology that made excuses or tried to justify silence. It was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to doing better. "That means a lot, Linda," Jasmine said, her voice soft but firm. "It takes courage to admit when you were wrong, and I appreciate that." Linda nodded, her eyes welling with emotion. "I've been reading more, listening more. I don't want to be one of those people who just stays out of things, hoping it will get better on its own. That's not enough anymore." Jasmine could see how much Linda had grown in just a few weeks. This wasn't a woman trying to absolve herself with a quick apology. This was someone who was genuinely rethinking her place in this community, reconsidering how she interacted with the people around her. As the conversation continued, Jasmine realized that what had begun as a painful and isolating experience was slowly becoming something more profound, a catalyst for change. While not everyone in Oakwood Estates had come to the same conclusions as Linda, the whispers of change were spreading. There was a sense that the community as a whole was beginning to acknowledge the realities of racial inequality, even if it was uncomfortable. Later that evening, as Jasmine sat down to dinner with Landon, she reflected on the journey she had been on over the past few months. She had fought not just for her son's right to swim in the community pool, but for the right of every person of color in Oakwood to feel that they belonged. It wasn't enough to simply stand up to racism when it was blatant. Sometimes you had to plant seeds of change, even in the most unlikely places. Landon looked up from his plate and grinned. "Mom, you know what? I heard Mrs. Whitefield talking to Mrs. Peterson at the park today. She wasn't being mean anymore. She was just talking to her." Jasmine glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Oh, really?" "Yeah, she was laughing and everything. It was weird." Jasmine chuckled softly, but there was a deep sense of pride in her heart. Change was slow, but it was happening. And it wasn't just happening because of the confrontation at the pool. It was happening because she had fought for her son's dignity, because she had stood up not just for Landon, but for every child who deserved to feel safe and accepted. She knew there would be more battles ahead, more moments where she would have to fight for fairness, for justice, for equality. But in this moment, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. The seeds she had planted had begun to sprout, and they would grow into something stronger. And as for Karen Whitefield, well, Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew that the road ahead would be long, and the work of undoing a lifetime of prejudice wasn't something that could be done in a few weeks. But she also knew that the woman who had once grabbed her son's arm in anger was no longer the same person she had been before. She was a woman who had been forced to confront her own prejudices, even if only in small ways. That, in itself, was a victory. The days that followed were brighter, in more ways than one. Jasmine watched her community, Oakwood Estates, begin to evolve, and in that change, she saw hope. Not just for her son, but for a future where the things that divide people could finally be overcome. And in the quiet moments, when she sat watching Landon swim or ride his bike, Jasmine allowed herself a sense of peace, because she knew, deep down, that while one woman couldn't change the world overnight, one act of courage had the power to ripple outward and inspire the kind of change that could last.